Hi, everybody. This is Joel Butterly, co-founder and CEO of InGenius Prep. So a lot of you have asked questions about the relationship between the affirmative action ruling by the US Supreme Court and legacy admissions most recently in California. So wanted to take some time to answer a few of those questions. So these changes are coming about mostly because they're interrelated. That is to say, the ban on affirmative action almost certainly has a direct impact on whether states are going to allow things like legacy admissions, which in large part accomplishes the opposite of what affirmative action accomplishes. That is to say, it gives preference to individuals who have legacy status, and people with legacy status tend to be from overrepresented racial and ethnic groups. So that's primarily the reason. And it's also a reason why California is almost certainly not going to be the last state that bans legacy admissions. It's already not the first state that's banned legacy admissions. In terms of the admissions landscape, it's hard to estimate exactly how this will impact things. When California banned affirmative action in the 90s, what we saw was a significant decrease in Black, Latino, and white students and a significant increase in Asian students. It's unclear whether or not we'll see the same thing this time nationwide, but most likely the sort of ban on affirmative action and the ban on legacy admissions will, to some extent, cancel each other out. Perhaps not completely, but to some extent. In terms of what I think legacy applicants should be focused on, the reality is that legacy admissions is from the bygone era, and it's unlikely that legacy admissions is going to be particularly significant in the future. That is to say, if you're in ninth grade, it's not super likely that by the time you apply, that legacy admissions is going to matter all that much, depending on where you're applying to. So for those who have legacy status currently, you're probably catching this right at the tail end of when it's significant. And for those of you who are years away from applying, unfortunately, probably I wouldn't expect too much preferential treatment because of it. Finally, do I think that the decision on legacy admissions is beneficial for students? The short answer is yes. I think that the rationale for legacy admissions has long been that students who are legacies or families who have a lot of individuals who have attended the same university tend to give more to the university. And that's probably true, although schools, firstly, can probably get by without it. And secondly, they can probably get the donations that they need from other sources. That is to say, it would almost be better if instead of allowing in 20 to 30% of a class that are legacies in the hopes that they'll donate more, to admit 5 totally undeserving students whose families have to donate $200 million. And that way you're just being very straightforward about what you're doing, right? You're selling spots, but it allows you to subsidize tuition of a whole bunch of students that otherwise wouldn't be able to afford it. So I do think that legacy is probably not something that we want to see going on into the future. And I do support that decision. Depends on the state. So California's ban applied to private universities like Stanford, not just public universities like Cal State, UCLA, UC Berkeley, et cetera. The majority of these bills are likely to target not just public, but also private universities. And then there is likely to be a Supreme Court case around that particular issue. There's a very famous Supreme Court case between the state of New Hampshire and Dartmouth College, which was litigated by Daniel Webster. There's a famous quote from it that Dartmouth is a small college, but there are those who love it. It's not clear whether states actually have the authority to regulate legacy admissions at private institutions. They very well might, but that's likely to be a court case. Nonetheless, most of these bills are probably going to impact both public and private institutions. Many of these private institutions also take federal funds and sometimes state funds. So there's probably an argument to be made about regulating it. My initial thoughts is that this is going to be the first state of many to come. I think that legacy admissions isn't likely to survive the next 10 to 15 years, especially with the kind of ban on affirmative action. It makes sense that you would have a ban in the opposite direction as well, which would be legacy admissions, which kind of preferentially address what are typically overrepresented races and ethnicities. So my initial thoughts are this is the new norm, along with a ban on affirmative action. I think that it's reasonably significant. California is not the first state to do, but it's still significant because it is the first state in this sort of new post affirmative action era to do so. And I think that we are likely to see a lot more states following suit. So it will likely change the layout of admissions as more and more states adopt this. For example, Massachusetts has a bill to ban legacy preferences at both public and private institutions. So that would include schools like MIT, Tufts, Harvard, et cetera. And likely that will have a significant impact. Schools like Harvard have somewhere between 20 and 30% of their admitted students with legacy status currently, at least according to the data from the Students for Fair Admissions Supreme Court case. We're likely to see that change quite a bit in the future. Even if you were a legacy, you still needed to have significant merit in order to get admitted. It's not like legacy admissions meant that you were admitting students who were totally unqualified. It basically was used as a tiebreaker. And since there are so many students with such comparable levels of qualification, you end up with a fairly large proportion of students with legacy admission. But these students weren't unqualified, or at least in the vast majority of cases, they were not unqualified. Essentially, what this means is that you need to probably have, most likely these students were academically qualified, but you still need to be academically qualified, meaning your grades and your scores still need to be at a certain level for the schools that you're applying to. It also just means that your extracurricular activities need to be a little bit more impressive, right? So it's just not enough to do things at your school. You have to do things in your community. You have to create your own initiatives, your own student groups, your own nonprofits or for-profits. You need to do research. The level of your extracurricular activities probably needs to be a little bit higher. But we're talking about a quantitative shift, not so much a qualitative shift in what you need to do. But the legacy is never really a good thing to rely on because you want to get into schools just on your own merit. And hopefully this ends up being a good thing for those students as well. A lot of students prioritize, particularly in early decision, schools where they have legacy status. I would say that for at least students who are in California, that really won't be the case anymore. You should prioritize schools that you're most likely to get into regardless. But for most students that are relying on legacy admissions, you're probably relying on legacy admissions in a state that has not banned legacy admissions. So I think for those students, likely the strategy doesn't change. I think you're doing pretty much the same thing. Anytime something like legacy is banned or SATs are diminished in their importance or become optional or schools become test blind, it has the effect of increasing the importance of other academic credentials, so like GPA, in this case, potentially SAT, depending on what schools you're applying to, and then also your extracurricular activities. But this has been the trend for the last 10 to 20 years. There's been a kind of gradual increase in the importance of your activities over other items. And the one thing I tell people is that if you really want to be qualified for the most selective schools in the US, you really have to be an expert at something. You need to have chosen a specific area of interest and gone far enough with that interest that you can rightfully be called an expert for your age. That's really the kind of big secret. So that's going to become increasingly the norm with this decision in California. The short answer is yes. Generally speaking, there's been a mixed history of state legislatures trying to regulate private schools, private universities in their state and their admissions practices. A really famous example was a case that was litigated by Daniel Webster between Dartmouth College, which is my alma mater in the state of New Hampshire. And it was the foundational case that established that private universities were, in many cases, beyond the reach of state governments and federal governments, or the federal government. It's unclear in this case whether the foundation for banning legacy admissions, for example, if their argument is that it is inherently discriminatory, it is unclear whether that would fall under an exemption for the regulation of these institutions, but it is quite likely that these institutions will push back. If not in California, then likely in other states, which are probably going to follow suit in terms of the ban on legacy admissions.